The hallways of the Westwood Conservatory always felt like they were holding their breath. They were long and polished, so shiny you could see your face wobble in them as you walked. The air smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the faint, ghostly scent of rosin from 100 violins. For the other students, this smell was home. For Maya, it was a constant reminder that she was a visitor. She was a girl from a neighborhood where the sidewalks were cracked and the music came from car radios, not from grand pianos inside marble buildings. Here, she was a scholarship kid, a number on a page, and most of the time, she felt completely invisible. She would walk through the crowded halls, and it was like she had a cloak that made people look right through her. The other students, with their expensive leather bags and their easy laughter, would swirl around her without ever seeming to notice she was there. They talked about things she didn't understand: summer camps in Switzerland, famous musicians they had met, their parents' connections in the orchestra. Maya would just clutch her worn-out folder of sheet music to her chest and keep her eyes down, watching her own worn sneakers on the gleaming floor. Her folder was old, the edges soft from years of use. It was a hand-me-down from her older cousin, and it felt like a symbol of everything that separated her from them. It was practical and used. While their lives seemed brand new, her piano lessons with Madame Dubois were the worst part of her week. The woman's studio was at the end of the hall, a large room with a high ceiling and a window that looked out onto a perfect green lawn. Madame Dubois herself was sharp and elegant, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She always smelled of faint perfume and disapproval. "Again," Madame Dubois would say. Her voice thin and sharp. After Maya had finished a piece, Maya would play, her fingers moving carefully over the keys. She knew the notes. She had practiced for hours every single night in her small apartment with the keyboard that had a few sticky keys. She could play every note perfectly, in the right time, with the right pressure. But it was never enough. "No, no, no," Madame Dubois would sigh, a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. She would get up and stand behind Maya, her shadow falling over the keys. "You are playing the notes, Maya. You are not playing the music. It is like you are reading a recipe out loud, but you have never tasted the food. There is no feeling. There is no life." Maya's heart would sink. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell Madame Dubois that she did feel things. She felt the pressure of her parents' hopes, which were so heavy they sometimes made it hard to breathe. She felt the loneliness of being the only one in her family who understood this strange world of classical music. She felt the sting of being invisible. But how could she put that into the music? How could she make the piano speak a language she was only just learning herself? So she would just nod and say, "Yes, Madame Dubois," and her voice would come out as a tiny squeak. Her theory class wasn't any better. Mr. Harrison, a man with a rumpled suit and tired eyes, would drone on about chord progressions and counterpoint. He would hand back graded papers, and Maya would always get a B-. It wasn't a bad grade, but it wasn't a good one either. It was the grade of someone who was just there, just getting by. "Adequate," he had written on her last paper. The word felt like a little gray cloud that followed her around. She wasn't failing, but she wasn't succeeding. She was just taking up space. The end-of-term recital was the biggest event of the semester. It was a big deal, a formal night where students played for their families, for the faculty, and sometimes for talent scouts from the big city orchestras. Everyone was talking about what piece they were going to play. Maya had planned to play something safe, something she knew she could get right, a simple sonata by Mozart. She just wanted to get through the night without embarrassing herself. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, she was called into the main office. It was a room with dark wood paneling and heavy furniture that made her feel even smaller than usual. Madame Dubois was there, and so was Mr. Harrison. They were both sitting on the other side of a large desk, and they looked very serious. Maya sat in the chair opposite them, her hands twisting in her lap. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking loudly on the wall. "Maya," Madame Dubois began, her voice softer than it was in the studio, but in a way that felt even more serious. "We have been discussing your progress?" Mr. Harrison leaned forward. We see that you are a very dedicated student. You always do your work and you are never late. Maya just nodded, not sure where this was going. It sounded like the beginning of a bad conversation. We believe you are ready for a real challenge, Madame Dubois said, a strange glint in her eye. Something that will push you to find the fire that we know is hidden somewhere inside you. She slid a piece of sheet music across the desk. It was thicker than the others, with lots of notes crowded together on the pages. Maya picked it up. The title at the top read, La Campanella, by Franz Liszt. She had heard of it. It was famous for being one of the hardest pieces ever written for the piano. The seniors, the best players in the school, talked about it with a mix of fear and awe. We want you to play this for the recital, Mr. Harrison said. Maya felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She looked from the music to their faces. Were they joking? This was impossible. It was like asking someone who had just learned to swim to cross the ocean. I don't think I can, she whispered, her voice shaking. Nonsense, Madame Dubois said, a hint of her usual sharpness returning. It will be good for you. It will force you to stop thinking so much and just feel the music. Don't worry about being perfect. Just focus on the notes. Try to keep up. But Mia could see it in their eyes. They didn't think she could do it. They weren't giving her a challenge. They were setting her up to fail. It was a test she was supposed to fail, a polite way of telling her she didn't belong here. They wanted her to get on that stage in front of everyone and fall flat on her face. The thought made her feel sick with fear. Her hands felt cold and sweaty, but then, as she stared at the impossible tangle of black notes on the page, something else flickered inside her. It was tiny, like a single spark in a dark room. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like defiance. They thought she was empty. They thought she was just a girl who played the notes. They had no idea who she was or where she came from, or what she had learned in the small, smoky jazz club where her grandfather played the piano every night. She took a deep breath, the cold knot in her stomach loosening just a little. She looked Madame Dubois right in the eye. Okay, Maya said, her voice quiet but steady. I'll do it. As she walked out of the office, the heavy sheet music felt like a lead weight in her bag. But it also felt like a secret, a challenge. They had given her an impossible piece, thinking it would be her end. But as she stepped out into the bright sunlight and began her journey home, she had a feeling they might have just made a very big mistake. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The school day felt like it was dragging on forever. Every minute in her last class, a history lesson about wars and dates that felt 1,000,000 miles away, was a minute she wasn't where she needed to be. The La Campanella music felt like a brick in her bag, heavy and demanding. She kept picturing the looks on her teachers' faces, the polite, dismissive way they had set her this trap. They saw her as a ghost, a girl who played the notes without any soul. They had no idea. The final bell couldn't ring soon enough. She didn't head for the pristine practice, rooms with their soundproof walls and perfectly tuned grand pianos. Instead, she walked out the front gates of Westwood Conservatory, leaving that world of polished floors and silent judgment behind. She walked to the bus stop on the corner, a small plastic shelter with a cracked bench. The city bus that arrived was nothing like the shiny cars her classmates got picked up in. It was big and rumbled, and the floors were sticky. She found an empty seat by the window, watching the neat green lawns and big houses of the school neighborhood slowly change into something else. The streets got busier, the buildings closer together. The world outside her window became her world, small shops with signs in different languages, people walking with purpose, the sound of sirens in the distance. This was the real world, and it was here that she felt she could finally breathe. She got off about 20 minutes later, in a part of town that felt alive. The air here didn't smell of floor wax. It smelled of food cooking from street vendors and rain on hot pavement. She walked down a block until she came to a small doorway with a simple, hand-painted sign that read, "The Corner Pocket." There was no flashy marquee, no line of people waiting to get in. It was just a quiet door like a secret. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The change was immediate. The bright afternoon sun was gone, replaced by a warm, dim light. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, beer, and something else. Something like history. The club was empty now, but she could almost feel the echo of last night's music, the ghost of laughter and clinking glasses. The floor was scuffed and worn from 1,000 dancing feet, and the small tables were stacked upside down on chairs. At the far end of the room, on a slightly raised platform, was a piano. It wasn't a gleaming, perfect grand piano like the ones at Westwood. It was an old upright, its wood darkened with age, with a few nicks and scratches that looked like wrinkles on a wise old face. To Maya, it was more beautiful than any piano in the world. Behind the long bar, a man was wiping a glass with a clean white cloth. He was older, with a head of thick, white hair and a face that was lined with a map of smiles. He didn't move with the stiff formality of the people at her school. He moved with an easy, slow grace like a cat in a sunbeam. This was her grandfather Levi. He looked up as the door closed, and his whole face softened into a smile. "Hey there, songbird," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "You're early today." Maya walked over to the bar and slid onto one of the stools. She dropped her heavy bag on the floor with a thud. "It was a day," she said. Levi put the glass down and leaned on the bar, looking at her. He had eyes that saw everything. "Those fancy teachers giving you a hard time again?" Maya let out a long breath. She didn't have to pretend here. She didn't have to be the quiet, invisible girl. You could say that. She reached into her bag and pulled out the thick stack of paper. She slid it across the bar to him. "They gave me this." Levi picked up the music. He held it carefully like he was holding a fragile bird. He squinted at the title. "La Campanella," he read, sounding it out slowly. He whistled softly, a low, impressed whistle. "Franz Liszt? One of those classical boys who like to use a whole lot of notes to say a simple thing." He didn't sound intimidated. He sounded amused, like he was looking at a very complicated puzzle someone had left on his doorstep. "They think I can't do it," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "They think I'm empty, that I just play the notes." Levi looked from the music to her face. His gaze was so kind it made her eyes sting. "And what do you think?" Maya looked down at her hands, resting on the worn wooden bar. "I don't know. It's so many notes. It's so fast." She felt the fear creeping back in, the cold knot in her stomach. Levi didn't say anything for a moment. He just went back to wiping his glass. Then he said, "When I was a kid, I couldn't afford no sheet music. I learned by listening. I'd sit in the back of smoky joints just like this one, and I'd listen to the old-timers play. They weren't playing notes on a page. They were telling stories. They were talking with their hands." He put the glass down and came out from behind the bar. He walked over to the old upright piano and sat on the worn bench. He patted the spot next to him. "Come here." Maya slid off the stool and went over to him, sitting beside him on the bench. The piano keys were yellowed with age, but they felt familiar under her fingers like an old friend. "Don't play it for me yet," Levi said, gently closing the lid over the keys. "Just tell me. When you look at that first page, all them little black bugs crawling all over the paper, what do you feel? Not what do you think. What do you feel?" Maya was quiet for a long time. No one had ever asked her that. Madame Dubois asked if she was playing in time. Mr. Harrison asked if she understood the harmonic structure. No one asked her what she felt. She closed her eyes and pictured the music. "It feels like running," she said slowly, finding the words. "Like running through a field of tiny bells, and you have to be so fast you don't break any of them. But it also feels, scary. Like if you fall, you'll get hurt." Levi nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod. "There you go. That's the story. The running, the bells, the fear. That's the music right there. The rest is just details." He lifted the lid over the keys. He didn't play anything from the Liszt piece. Instead, he played a simple melody, just a handful of notes in the middle of the piano. But the way he played them, it was like he was breathing. The notes swelled and then softened, they leaned into each other, they had a pulse. It was the simplest thing she had ever heard, but it was also the most beautiful. You hear that? He asked, his fingers still resting on the keys. That space between the notes? That's where the life is. That's the breath. Your teachers, they want you to play the notes. I want you to play the spaces. Make the audience hold their breath waiting for the next sound. Make them feel the silence. He played the simple melody again, but this time he changed it just a little. He added a sad blue note here, a hopeful little flicker there. He wasn't just playing a tune. He was having a conversation. He was showing her joy and sorrow, all with a few keys on an old piano. Maya watched his hands. They weren't delicate and perfect like the hands of the concert pianist she saw on YouTube. They were strong, with thick fingers and calluses on the tips. They were hands that had worked hard, hands that knew how to fix a leaky pipe and how to coax a story out of a piano. La Campanella, Levi said, his voice soft. It's just a story. A story about a little bell. A fast story, a flashy story. But it's still just a story. And you, my girl, you're a storyteller. You always have been. You just forgot. He looked at her, his eyes twinkling in the dim light of the club. So don't you be scared of them notes? You just tell your story. You tell them about the bells and the running and the fear. And then you show them how you fly right over it. He stood up and went back behind the bar, leaving her sitting at the piano. Maya looked at the old, familiar keys, then back at the intimidating sheet music sitting on the bar. For the first time, it didn't look like a trap. It didn't look like a wall. It looked like a brand new language, a thrilling, complicated language that she was suddenly excited to learn. They had given her an impossible piece because they thought she was empty. But sitting there in the quiet, human warmth of her grandfather's club, she had never felt more full. The next morning, the world felt different. The familiar hallways of Westwood Conservatory, which had always felt like a place where she had to hide, now felt like a battlefield. She carried the secret of her grandfather's words like a small, warm stone in her pocket. Tell the story, he had said. Play the spaces. But as she walked past the students practicing in their glass-walled rooms, their backs straight, their fingers flying with perfect, machine-like precision, a cold doubt began to creep in. Their world was so clean, so exact. Her world, the world of smoky clubs and feelings, felt messy and out of place. She found an empty practice room, one of the small ones in the basement that no one really wanted. It was cramped and smelled a little musty. She closed the door, the sound of it clicking shut echoing in the silence. She placed the La Campanella sheet music on the stand. The black notes seemed to stare back at her, a crowd of tiny judges. She took a deep breath, remembering her grandfather's face, the gentle way he spoke. She placed her fingers on the keys. She started to play. At first, she tried to play it exactly as written, the way Madame Dubois would want. But it felt stiff, dead. Her fingers were just going through the motions. So she closed her eyes and tried to forget the rules. She tried to remember the feeling of running through a field of bells. She let her fingers find the story. The famous little notes that were supposed to sound like a small bell, she played them a little softer, letting them ring out into the silence before the next flurry of notes began. In a fast, complicated passage, she let herself lean into the rhythm just a tiny bit, adding a swing, a heartbeat that wasn't written on the page. It felt right. It felt alive. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the door open. She didn't see Mr. Harrison standing there, his arms crossed, his face a mask of confusion. She only noticed him when she finished the phrase, and the silence that followed felt heavy. She opened her eyes and jumped. Maya, he said, his voice flat. He walked into the room and closed the door behind him. What was that? I was just practicing, she stammered, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. That was not what is on the page, he said, pointing a finger at the sheet music. That swing you are putting in the 16th note runs. It is not there. And that pause before the recapitulation of the theme? Liszt did not write a fermata there. Maya felt her face get hot. I know, It felt like it needed to breathe. Mr. Harrison let out a short, sharp sigh. It is not your job to decide what the music needs. Liszt decided. Your job is to execute his vision with technical accuracy and respect. This is not a back alley jazz session where you can do whatever you please. This is classical music. There are rules. His words stung. Back alley jazz session? He was talking about her grandfather's world, her world. He was making it sound cheap and dirty. But the music has to have feeling, she said, her voice small but firm. Feeling comes from understanding the structure, the harmony, the composer's intent. It does not come from adding inappropriate grace notes because you feel like it, he said, his voice rising. You are being arrogant, Maya. You are a student. You have not earned the right to rewrite Liszt. He looked at her, his eyes stern. I am telling you this for your own good. If you play this piece the way you just played for me at the recital, you will be a laughingstock. You will fail this assignment. Do you understand? Play it as it is written. Every note, every rest, exactly as Liszt intended. He didn't wait for an answer. He just turned and left, the door clicking shut again, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. Maya stared at the music, the notes now looking like a cage. Arrogant, the word echoed in her head. Was he right? Was she just a kid who thought she knew better than a master? A wave of shame washed over her. The next few days were torture. Every time she practiced, she could hear Mr. Harrison's voice in her head. She tried to play it straight, to follow the rules, but the music felt like it was dying in her hands. It was just noise. Then she would try to put the feeling back in, and she would feel guilty like she was doing something wrong. She was trapped. The other students didn't help. One afternoon, she was practicing in a larger room, the door slightly ajar. She let herself get lost in the music, playing with the freedom her grandfather had taught her. She didn't notice the two senior girls who stopped outside the door to listen. Is that Maya playing La Campanella? One of them whispered. Yeah, it's so weird, the other one whispered back. She keeps messing with the rhythm. It's all floppy. My teacher says she's going to bomb at the recital. You can't just change Liszt, it's like disrespectful. Maya's fingers froze on the keys. She heard their giggles as they walked away. Disrespectful, arrogant, a laughingstock. The words piled up on top of her, a heavy weight that pushed the air from her lungs. She packed up her bag and left the conservatory, not even bothering to go to her last class. That evening, she didn't take the bus to the club with her usual sense of relief. She felt like she was carrying a storm inside her. When she pushed open the door to the corner pocket, the usual warm, welcoming smell of old wood felt like it was judging her. Her grandfather was behind the bar, polishing a glass. He looked up and smiled, but it faded when he saw her face. Rough day, songbird? He asked gently. Maya just shook her head. She couldn't speak. She walked over to the old upright piano and sat down. She stared at the keys, but she couldn't bring herself to play. Her hands felt like they were made of lead. All she could hear was Mr. Harrison's voice, the whispers of the other students. They were right. Who was she to think she could play with the masters? She was just a kid from a jazz club. She didn't belong. Her grandfather came out from behind the bar. He didn't say anything. He just pulled up another small stool and sat down beside her, not too close. He just sat there in the quiet with her, looking at the old piano. After a long time he spoke, his voice soft. You know, when I was first starting out, he began, I got a gig playing with this big band. The leader was a famous trumpet player, a real classy guy. He had me play this solo, and I played it, but I added a little blues run at the end. Just a little something extra. After the set, he tore me a new one. Right in front of everybody. Said I was cheapening the music. Said I didn't have the discipline to play it straight. Maya looked at him surprised. She had never heard this story. I felt about 2 inches tall, Levi continued, staring at the keys. I went home that night and felt like quitting. I thought, he's right. I'm just a hack from the wrong side of the tracks, but then I thought about it. And I realized something. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't right either. He loved his kind of music, the kind with all the rules written down, and I loved mine. They were just different languages. He looked at Maya, his eyes full of understanding. That teacher of yours, he loves his language. And it's a beautiful language. But you're bilingual. You can speak his language and you can speak mine. That's not a weakness, Maya. That's your strength. He reached over and gently tapped the sheet music she had left on the piano. This piece, this La Campanella, it's just a story. And there's 1,000 ways to tell a story. You can tell it the way everyone else tells it, or you can tell it your way. There ain't no right or wrong in that. There's only true or not true. Are you telling the truth when you play? Maya looked at her grandfather's kind, wrinkled face. She thought about his words, bilingual. It wasn't about being arrogant or disrespectful. It was about having a different way of speaking. The doubt was still there, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. But it was smaller now. The storm inside her began to calm. She looked at the keys, then at the music. She still didn't know what she was going to do at the recital. She was still scared. But as she sat there in the quiet club with the one person who understood, she knew one thing for sure. She had to find a way to tell the truth. The night of the recital felt like walking into a different world. The Westwood Conservatory's main concert hall was a place of grandeur. A high, arched ceiling seemed to swallow the sound, and heavy red velvet curtains draped the stage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of excited chatter. Hundreds of soft lights glowed from the ornate chandeliers, making the polished wood of the stage gleam. This was nothing like the dim, cozy warmth of the corner pocket. This was a palace, and Maya felt like an imposter, backstage in the cramped, nervous energy of the wings. The contrast was even sharper. Students in their finest clothes stretched their fingers and whispered last-minute advice to each other. Maya wore a simple dress her mother had bought for her, a modest blue that felt plain next to the shimmering silks and satins of the other girls. She clutched the sheet music, not because she needed it, but because it felt like a shield. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The words of her teachers and the whispers of her classmates swirled in her head, a storm of doubt. Arrogant, disrespectful, a laughingstock. She felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. What if they were right? What if her grandfather's gentle wisdom was just a kind lie to make her feel better? What if she got up there and the music died in her hands, just like it had in the practice room? She closed her eyes, blocking out the noise. She tried to picture her grandfather's face, the map of smiles around his eyes. Bilingual, he had said. Tell the truth. She took a slow, deep breath, trying to find the quiet strength in his words. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. Her story, one by one, the students went on stage. Maya watched from the wings. A tall, thin boy played a Bach sonata with such icy precision it felt like he was carving the notes out of ice. It was perfect, flawless, and utterly boring. A girl with a beautiful voice sang an opera aria, hitting every high note with stunning power, but her face was a blank mask. The audience clapped politely after each performance, a respectful but unenthusiastic sound. They were hearing technically perfect music, but they weren't feeling anything. They were just watching a display of skill. Then a voice from the side of the stage announced her name. And now, performing A Campanella by Franz Liszt, Maya. This was it. Her legs felt like they were made of wood as she walked out onto the stage. The single bright spotlight hit her, blinding her to the faces in the crowd, which was a small mercy. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. She walked to the grand piano in the center of the stage, a sleek, black monster that looked much more intimidating than her grandfather's friendly old upright. She sat on the bench, its leather cool and smooth. She could feel the silence in the hall, a heavy, waiting silence dot in the front row. She could just make out two figures. Madame Dubois and Mr. Harrison, they sat ramrod straight, their faces grim. They weren't looking at her with hope. They were looking at her with the grim expectation of watching a car crash. They had already decided she would fail. They were just there to watch it happen. Maya placed her fingers on the cool, smooth ivory keys. She looked at the sheet music on the stand, but she didn't really see it. She saw her grandfather's hands on the old piano. She heard his voice telling her to play the spaces. She took another deep breath, and she began. The opening notes were clear and bright, perfectly in time, exactly as Liszt had written them. In the front row, Mr. Harrison raised a skeptical eyebrow. He had expected a mess, a fumble of nerves from the first bar. This was, correct. But it was just correct. It was empty. He settled back in his seat, ready for the inevitable collapse when the difficult sections began. The music began to build. The famous little jumps, the notes that were meant to sound like tiny, clear bells, began to ring out. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first. The bells didn't just ring. They seemed to shimmer with a warmth, a lingering echo that wasn't written in the score. She was playing the spaces, letting each tiny note breathe its own little life before the next one arrived. The audience, who had been politely listening, started to lean forward in their seats. Something was different. As the piece sped up, the true test began. The dizzying, fast-paced passages that required incredible finger strength and speed. But Maya didn't just play them like a machine. She played them with a fluid, almost swinging rhythm. The notes weren't a frantic scramble. They were a flowing river, each note connected to the next with an invisible thread of feeling. Mr. Harrison sat forward, his confusion growing. This was unorthodox. It was wrong, according to the rules. But it was captivating. He had never heard the piece sound like this. It had a heartbeat. Madame Dubois's stern expression had cracked. Her mouth was slightly open. She was hearing the same notes she had heard 100 students play before, but this time they were telling a story. She could hear the story Maya had told her grandfather, the running, the bells, the fear. It was all there, woven into the fabric of the music. It wasn't just technically proficient. It was alive. Then came the moment. In the middle of the most complex and virtuosic section of the piece, a whirlwind of sound that should have been just a display of speed, Maya did it. She wove in a tiny, blues-inflected phrase, a handful of notes that bent just a little, a sound that belonged in a smoky jazz club, not a formal concert hall. It was so quick, so subtle, that 99% of the audience probably didn't even consciously register it, but everyone felt it. It was like a secret whispered in the middle of a shout. It was a spark of pure, unapologetic humanity in the middle of a mechanical storm. It was the sound of her grandfather's club, her home, her truth, shining through. That was the moment the hall changed completely. The polite attention was gone, replaced by absolute, spellbound silence. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. The entire audience was holding its breath, captivated by the girl on the stage who was not just playing a piece of music, but was tearing it apart and putting it back together with a soul they had never heard before. She played on, her confidence growing with every note. She wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't thinking about the rules or the teachers or the other students. She was just telling her story. The final, thundering chords of the piece were not just loud. They were a release, a declaration. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, and then silence. She played the final, single, hanging note. It rang out in the perfect silence of the hall, clear and pure and full of everything she had been feeling. And then it faded. The silence that followed was the most profound sound Maya had ever heard. It lasted for 3 full seconds, a space so full of awe you could feel it on your skin. And then the concert hall erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound so loud and so passionate it felt like it was going to lift the roof off the building. People were on their feet shouting, "Bravo!" Their faces, which had been polite masks before, were now alive with shock and joy and wonder. Maya sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys, her chest heaving, stunned by the force of it. In the front row, Mr. Harrison was on his feet, clapping so hard his hands were red, a look of complete and utter disbelief on his face. And next to him, Madame Dubois, the woman who had called her playing empty, had tears streaming down her face. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a warm, vibrating wall of sound that washed over her. Maya sat frozen at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys that had just unleashed a storm. The single spotlight felt hot on her skin, and for a moment the world was just a blur of light and noise. She could see shapes standing up in the darkness, but she couldn't make out faces. It didn't matter. She could feel their energy, a wave of pure, unfiltered shock and joy that was aimed right at her. This wasn't the polite, duty-bound applause she was used to. This was real. This was raw. And it was for her, slowly, as if waking from a dream, she stood up. Her legs felt shaky. She turned to face the darkness and gave a small, awkward bow. The roar only got louder. People were shouting things, but she couldn't make out the words. It was just a beautiful, overwhelming cacophony. She turned and walked off the stage, her steps unsteady. The moment she was in the wings, the noise from the hall softened slightly, and the world backstage came into sharp focus. It was a completely different place from the one she had left just 10 minutes ago. The air, which had been thick with nervous tension, was now buzzing with an electric excitement. Students who had ignored her for months were now looking at her with wide, wondering eyes. A girl from her theory class, one who always got perfect scores and had never once spoken to her, simply stared as Maya walked past, her mouth slightly agape. Another student, a boy who was known for his own technical brilliance, just shook his head slowly, a look of dazed respect on his face. No one whispered. No one giggled. They just watched her as if she were a ghost who had suddenly become solid. She found a small, quiet corner behind a heavy velvet curtain and leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was still beating fast, but now it was with a thrilling, dizzying joy. She had done it. She had told her story and they had listened. They had really listened. Maya, she looked up. It was Mr. Harrison and Madame Dubois. They were walking towards her, and their faces were not the grim, judgmental masks she was used to. They looked different. Mr. Harrison's face was a mixture of confusion and awe, like a man who had just seen a magic trick he couldn't explain. Madame Dubois's eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked older, softer, as if a hard shell around her had cracked and fallen away. They stopped in front of her. For a moment no one spoke. The noise from the hall was a distant roar. "How?" Mr. Harrison finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine, desperate question. That rubato in the development section? It was unorthodox, and that phrase in the coda, that was not Liszt. What was that? What technique was that? Maya looked at him, at the man who had called her arrogant and disrespectful. She saw no anger in his eyes now, only a deep, burning curiosity. He wasn't a teacher scolding a student anymore. He was a musician who had just heard something new and beautiful, and he had to know what it was. Madame Dubois reached out and gently touched Maya's arm. Her hand was trembling. "It was alive," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have heard that piece played 100 times by some of the best young pianists in the world. They play it perfectly, but you made it breathe. I felt the fear you were talking about, and then I felt you fly. How did you do that?" Maya looked from one teacher to the other. She saw the walls between them, the walls of rules and tradition and judgment, crumble into dust. They weren't her enemies anymore. They were just two people who loved music, and for the first time they were seeing it through her eyes. The fear and shame she had carried for weeks melted away, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She thought about her grandfather, his kind eyes, his wise old hands on the piano keys. She thought about the smoky club, the smell of old wood, the feeling of belonging. "My grandfather taught me that every note has to mean something," she said softly, her voice clear and steady in the noisy hallway. "You just have to listen." Mr. Harrison stared at her, processing her words. It was so simple, yet it explained everything. It wasn't a technique. It was a philosophy. Madame Dubois just closed her eyes and nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. They had assigned her an impossible piece, thinking it would expose her as a fraud. Instead, it had revealed her as a master of a language they were only just beginning to understand. Later that night, Maya took the bus home. The city lights blurred past her window, a river of gold and white. She wasn't carrying a heavy bag of doubt anymore. She felt light, almost weightless. She thought about the future. Her time at Westwood Conservatory would be different now. She wouldn't be invisible. She wouldn't be adequate. She would be the girl who played La Campanella her own way. She didn't know what that would mean. If she would get more solos, or if some teachers would still resent her for breaking the rules. But for the first time, she realized it didn't matter. She knew who she was, and she knew what her music was. That was enough. When the bus dropped her off, she didn't go straight to her small apartment. Instead, she walked the 2 blocks to the corner pocket. The sign was dark, but she could see a faint light glowing from the back window. She tried the door and it was unlocked. She stepped inside. The club was empty and silent, the chairs all put away, the floors clean. Her grandfather was behind the bar, wiping it down one last time. He looked up and saw her, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. He just put down his cloth and walked over to the old upright piano. He sat on the bench and patted the space next to him. Maya walked over and sat down, the worn felt of the bench familiar and comforting under her dot. He didn't say a word. He just placed his hands on the keys and began to play. It was a slow, simple melody. It was the sound of the little bell from La Campanella, but he played it his way. He played it with a bluesy soul, a warmth and a sadness that made it feel like a lullaby and a lament all at once. It was the sound of her story, filtered through his wisdom. Maya leaned her head against his shoulder, listening. In the quiet, empty club, with the music of her grandfather filling the space, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had gone to the conservatory to learn their language, and but she had come here to remember her own. And in the end, by weaving them together, she had created something entirely new. She was no longer just a student. She was a storyteller. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that this was only the beginning of her story.